I think we'll get going, and I'm sure a few people might join us as we get into the session. But to kick us off, thank you so much for being here today, everyone. Really big welcome to the session. This is the first of our two-part training on gender equality in capital markets. We've got quite a packed schedule for the session, so we'll be getting started now. Firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to the Pakistan Stock Exchange for hosting us today. We so appreciate this collaborative effort, and this program was developed with the IFC, with UN Women, Columbia University, and with support from the Luxembourg government as well. But of course, made possible by our hosts, PSX today. So we're really grateful for that. And to kick us off on that front, I'd firstly like to welcome Rada Latif from the PSX. Rada is the Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer, and she'll give us a short opening remark just to welcome you to the session. So thank you very much, Rada, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to our partners at the United Nations, SSE, which is the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, UN Women, IFC, Columbia University Sustainable Investing Research Initiative, and to all of you for taking part in this meaningful initiative. Together, let's ensure that these 2 days inspire us to actively promote gender equality in our workplace and beyond, of course. When we look at Pakistan Stock Exchange, we solidified our commitment to transparency and sustainability by becoming a partner exchange of the United Nations SSE initiative in 2022. From there on, we've been working with the UN SSE to gain technical assistance, consensus building, and research to contribute in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and to stimulate the investment for a sustainable future. We have been working to sort of build capacity of the listed companies, their representatives, to be able to report well on sustainable initiatives and thereon learn also. PSX has partnered again with UNSCI to work towards this common objective to foster the financial market and support the growth of sustainable and responsible business practices. The world won't meet its sustainability goals without addressing gender issues, and sustainability standards and similar systems have an important role to play by setting gender responsible standards. Gender equality is one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 and is crucial to achieving many of these goals, from eradicating poverty and hunger to decent work and economic growth, peace, and justice. Yet, at the current rates of progress, it will take more than 100 years for women to be represented equally in positions of power and leadership in the workforce. And while progress has been made on these indicators, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, some of these indicators have gone into reverse as well. At the Pakistan Stock Exchange, we believe in the concept of gender equality. It was for that reason in a positive move forward, signifying our efforts to promote increased women participation, gender equality, and adopting gender responsive practices and policies. Pakistan Stock Exchange became a signatory of the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, more commonly known as WEPs, in January of 2023. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this dedicated 2-day training workshop on gender equality and addressing complexities in the capital market, organized in collaboration with the UNSCI, IFC, UN Women, and the Columbia University Sustainable Investing Research Initiative. This workshop will be invaluable. It is an opportunity for us to deepen our understanding of gender equality and learn the practical ways to drive positive change. Gender equality isn't just a goal in itself. It's a key to creating an inclusive, thriving workplace, and of course, a resilient economy as a result thereof. As professionals dedicated to building a better workplace, Your participation here represents an important commitment to fostering an environment that values and supports every individual. This is an exclusive session designed to provide our listed companies and the capital market stakeholders with hands-on learning and real-world tools that can be directly applied within your respective teams and departments. Over these 2 days, we'll delve into crucial aspects of gender equality, from fair hiring practices to creating inclusive pathways for leadership. With expertise from the UNSSE team, our focus will be on practical applications, strategies, and actions that can make a measurable difference within our own organization. This workshop will be a collaborative, participatory exercise and experience. Through discussions, case studies, and interactive exercises, we'll explore new approaches and perspective, gaining the insights we need to make our workplace a fairer, more balanced environment for everyone. I encourage each one of you to engage fully, as a question you raise and perspective you bring will enrich this experience for all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to an impactful and enlightening workshop's first session for all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rada, for setting such great context. I invite you to join our training panel of speaker. You covered some of my points in an excellent way, so thank you so much. That was wonderful to get us started. So now we're going to be moving into a little bit of an overview from my side of what the training covers today and just a few practical points as well. So I'll cover off a few of those points to get us started. So as Rada's, I think, introduced so well, today's training is all around looking at the interface of gender equality and global markets. And as many of you may already feel, gender equality and finance can be both a sensitive as well as a complex topic. So rather than pretending that that complexity doesn't exist, what we aim to do in this training is to better understand it and identify means of moving forwards. So today's session particularly looks at those complexities in the first session to introduce it. And then in our second session later on in the week, we're going to be getting into some more action-oriented mechanisms for advancing gender equality and addressing these complexities. But before we do, a few housekeeping points to cover. So as we've mentioned, this is a two-part session. So we have our first 2 hours today, and our next part will be coming up on Wednesday. Throughout the session, we'll have live Q&A chat, and we'll have some interactive activities as well using Mentimeter and the poll function in Zoom. So we really encourage you to engage with participation through all of those mechanisms. As Rada already said, the session is so much enriched by your perspectives and your views. So we really do want to see those as we come along. So very much encourage you to take part throughout. And finally, we'll cover this in a little bit more detail later, but for participating in the 2 sessions, you will receive a completion certificate as well. And we'll explain more at the end of the program about how you do that, but there'll be a feedback survey that you need to fill in to receive your certificate. So a couple more practical points. You will have noted that all of the participants are on mute in the session. However, as I said, we really encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A functions to get in contact with us. So please use the chat to introduce yourself or make any general comments you might have or share your practices perhaps. And then in the Q&A box, make sure that any questions you have for us go there, because this allows us to track the questions properly and to provide our answers to them as well. And you should also have the option to provide an anonymous question through the Q&A function as well, if you prefer to do that. Great. So just to introduce a little bit about who is going to be speaking on today's session. So firstly, you have myself and Landon from the UNSSE Training Academy team, who'll be delivering from the SSE team. We're very fortunate to be joined by our partners at UN Women, and we have Nabila Zar Malik, who will be speaking today about some of the work that UN Women are doing on this topic later on in the session. So a very warm welcome to Nabila, and thank you for joining us. We'll also be joined later on in the session by our guest speaker, Harry Agomba from Bloomberg, who'll be telling us a little bit more around the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index in particular, and his work in impact investment. Okay, so as I've mentioned already, gender equality is a complex topic, and it should be seen as such, because if you think perhaps that gender is a simple issue, maybe it's something that you haven't actually thought about enough yet. But to guide us through that complexity, we've broken this training program into 4 clear steps that both individuals and organizations can use as they address this complexity, and to consider how to enhance gender equality in their operations and processes. So part 1 looks at the first 2 steps around preparation and alignment. And in these first 2 steps, we're focusing on what gender equality is, why it's important, and providing an overview of the main standards and guidelines that can guide performance on this topic. Part 2 then digs into the action. So the second 2 steps are all around implementation and communication. So the training program we're introducing today has these 4 modules aligned to these 4 different areas that I mentioned there. These have been developed to walk you through the 4 steps for improving gender equality performance. So today we're going to be focusing on those first 2 steps around prepare and align. And then in our second session together, we'll be covering the second half around communication and implementation. And I think what's really important to note here as well is that this is, of course, an ongoing process. So once you've started communicating on your gender equality performance, that doesn't necessarily mean you're done, perhaps, with implementation and alignment. Like many other sustainability topics, this is going to be a constant process of improvement. So whilst we present these steps in this order for the purposes of the training, of course, in practice, you're more likely to be working across these 4 areas in unison. So we also just want to outline what we're hoping that you will come away with from the session today in terms of learning areas. So firstly, we hope that you'll be able to understand why action is needed for enhanced gender equality, and that you'll be able to identify what tools can be used to improve gender equality. And so just to show you what our time breaks out as today, this is our agenda for today's part 1 session. So we'll be going through a bit of an introduction to the course and the topic, which I've been covering with you now. We'll then spend our next segment of the course looking at preparation. We'll have a short break, you'll be happy to hear, I'm sure, in the middle of the session, just to refresh ourselves. And then we'll focus on the step 2 around alignment, and some time for wrap up and questions at the end. But as I said, please do continue to ask your questions throughout the session. It's great to have those as we go along as well in the Q&A box. Okay, so that's everything in terms of overview. But to get the session started, what we'd really like to know actually is a little bit of a sense from you all as to where you're up to currently in your understanding and work on this topic. So Landon will just shortly be sharing with you in the chat a link to access the Menti. So I'll just start sharing my screen as well from Menti, because that will give you the information as well to join. There we go. So if you follow that link that Landon has shared with you in the chat there, you also have another few options for joining us. You can go to menti.com and enter the code that you see at the top of the screen in Menti, or you can also use that QR code, which I've just put up on the screen there for you as well. So our first question, I'll just give you a moment to get into Menti, but the first question that we have for you is we just want to understand what your current level of comfort is on these topics. So your confidence and knowledge of gender equality and global markets, how comfortable you might be on discussing these topics with others. I'll just remove that so we can see, and how likely you are to take action to improve gender equality in your organization. So I see we've had a few of you respond to the Menti already, which is great. So I'll just give you all a second to have a look at that and access it. As I said, we will be using Menti at various points in the session, so it's a good opportunity just to test that you can get in there and access it as well. And do feel free to send us a question as well if you are having any problems, and we'll do our best to try and help you get into that Menti as well if there's any issues there. Okay, thanks for everyone who's responded. So I can see that we're coming out at sort of medium level of confidence around knowledge of gender equality in global markets, and then perhaps the average feeling a little bit more comfortable around discussing the topic and taking action. But yeah, kind of a range with some participants I see coming out quite high on the end in terms of the comfort, and then some in the mid to lower comfort levels as well. So that's, of course, why we're all here today, to learn more. And I think there's never an end point necessarily to our learning on this topic. So that's really useful to get your sense. So thanks everyone for that. And then what I'll do now is I'll just take us back into the slide presentation. Sorry, just excuse me, I've got my thing in the way there. Great, thanks everyone for letting us know that. That was really useful. And as I said, if you keep Menti open, we'll come back to it later as well. But yeah, I think what's really now important that we move on to thinking about is that enhancing gender equality and looking at that real connection to finance as well, which I know perhaps was an area that is more unfamiliar at the moment. So this first unit that we're going to be moving into now will look at that connection between gender equality and finance. So that's starting with the prepare element of our programme. So firstly, we're looking at three main areas here. So we're looking at the purpose of reporting and action on gender equality, so the case for why it matters. We're then going to come on to the landscape and then talk about some of the language and terms as well in this regard. But starting in our first area around purpose, why does this matter? So to get started, it's important to highlight that equality between genders is indeed a human right. It's widely documented that women and girls experience adverse impacts of business activities differently and often disproportionately. They also face additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies. Moreover, because of multiple forms of discrimination, different women and girls may be affected differently by business activities, depending on their age, their colour, their caste, class, ethnicity, religion, language, literacy, access to economic resources, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, residence in a rural location, and potentially also based on their migration, their indigenous or minority status. So clearly that's a very long list of aspects that can influence how someone is treated. But what's that to say really is that this is complex and it's interconnected across those different considerations. So the document that you can see on the screen is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these are global authoritative standards to prevent, mitigate, and remediate business-related adverse human rights impacts. So we've flagged on this slide a few of those key principles to help us understand the obligations that businesses have. So the first principle we highlight here is number 14, which indicates that the responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights applies to all enterprises, regardless of their size, their sector, operational context, etc. The second principle we highlight here is number 16, which encourages businesses to express their commitment to meet human rights responsibly through a statement of policy that should have certain characteristics. And so you can read more about that in the document that's linked on the screen. I should say as well that all of the resources that we're sharing with you today are available to download from our webpage, which Landon has shared the link to with you in the chat. So if you want to access any of these resources afterwards, you can find those in the slide handout on the webpage. And so another principle we want to flag is number 20, which highlights that to verify whether adverse human rights impacts are being addressed, businesses should track the effectiveness of their response using sex disaggregated data. So this needs to be collected in line with a human rights-based approach and outcomes indicators developed in consultation with affected people and gender experts. So we'll be discussing that topic in more detail in part 2 in our communication module, but it's important also to recognise that even if perhaps the data isn't reported publicly, it's important to disaggregate it so that you can make better decisions internally and identify any issues as they arise. And so finally, Principle 21 particularly highlights the important role of communication. And so according to this principle, businesses should be prepared to communicate externally, particularly when concerns are raised by or on behalf of affected stakeholders. So what's important here is to think about that communication as being responsive to gender discrimination and the differentiated impacts that are experienced by women. So all of this is really kind of showing that in addition to it being the right thing to do to promote gender equality, that actually from a financial perspective, it has both a positive impact and is something that actually organizations should be considering. So policies or legal risks and reputational risks are, of course, important concerns for business when it comes to gender equality and social disclosures as well. So it's also important to note that the sustainable development more broadly depends on equality of genders. So you might recognize this image here from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And gender equality is in of its own self one of the 17 SDGs that were agreed on by UN member states. But of course, it also contributes to many other of the SDGs. So the SDGs represent an ambitious attempt to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve our lives and well-being. So SDG 5 focuses on gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, but aspects of gender equality appear in targets and the associated indicators in 10 out of the 17 different SDGs. So if you'd like to see more on this, we recommend looking at the SSE's guidance around this topic as well, which we can share with you. So what exactly does improving gender equality do for our society in terms of benefits? So firstly, we see that studies showing that when we have more equality of genders in society, we also see lower levels of violence. We see greater economic productivity and increased resilience against financial and environmental crises. So what I want to remind you of is that by gender equality, we don't want to imply that more women than men need to have rights, but equality means that both women and men are represented, have the same level of power, and are both heard and understood equally. However, to achieve gender equality, in many cases, we do need to provide extra support to less represented genders, which of course in most cases is to women. So to give you an example of the extent of impact that gender equality currently has on society, a study by the World Bank estimates that loss in human capital wealth due to gender equality is over 160 trillion US dollars. And another study concluded that the equal participation of men and women entrepreneurs could actually boost global GDP by between 3 to 6%. And there's some links in the bottom of this slide here if you want to find out more about those studies. So if we promote equality of both genders, we've been found to see many positive social, environmental, and economic, and ultimately business benefits. So if we narrow it a bit deeper into the benefits that companies can find from enhancing equality in their organizations, we can see that companies with higher levels of diversity, that's both ethnic and gender diversity, at executive level are generally higher performing than their less diverse counterparts, both in terms of their profitability, but also their long-term value creation. Different genders, of course, have different attitudes to risk as well. So if our decision makers are gender diverse across our organization and programs, this can give us more balanced decision making. Different genders experience the world differently and of course have different views and ideas. Companies with workplaces and policies that support and promote gender equality are also ultimately better able to attract and retain talent. And gender lens investing, which is something we'll come to talk about more in our session later on, has shown a big increase globally from 100 million US dollars to 2.4 billion between 2014 and 2018. So companies with more diverse boards and senior management are demonstrating better performance, better business practice, and ultimately are better able to attract investment funding as well as a result of that. So let's have a look at one of the many studies on this topic, just to see a bit more detail about the benefits that diverse companies are seeing. So firstly, this data comes from a study by FP Analytics, which is an independent research and advisory division on foreign policy. So the study looked particularly at industries that are traditionally male dominated, looking at over 2,000 listed companies around the world and doing, of course, some interviews and in-depth surveys as well. So the studies find that companies with more women on their board have on average a higher profit, greater transparency, and higher social ratings as well. So let's look at those three different statistics in a little bit more detail. So firstly, on profitability, the study found that companies with a higher percentage of women in management were on average 47% more profitable than those with the lowest diversity. And these findings are consistent with other evidence that promoting gender equality can benefit a business's bottom line. Secondly, on transparency, building trust across stakeholder groups, including employees, consumers, regulators, and investors, is vital for industries that are working to evolve their business models, improve regulatory compliance and performance, and respond to changing consumer needs. And the study here found that the companies with the highest percentage of women on their boards were more transparent in terms of ESG information disclosure. And in particular, companies with at least one woman on their board are 17% more transparent than those with no female board members. And finally, if we look at CSR or social performance ratings, as it's referred to here, the analysis found a positive correlation between gender diversity on corporate boards and companies' social responsibility performance. So women who were interviewed for this study provided many first-hand accounts of their efforts to protect safety and labor rights, to integrate community development into business strategy, and build local capacity for women. So again, showing that where that female leadership was represented, actually it was contributing to more holistic social performance as well. And as well as those internal benefits from gender equality, then of course there are important external societal and environmental effects as well from gender diversity. So another interesting aspect of this same study was that equality not only had an impact within the company, but also for the environment where it operates as well. So for example, more diverse boards were 39% more likely to reduce their carbon emissions. They were also 46% more water efficient, and they were 60% more energy efficient than their peers with less diverse boards. So I think that's quite a fascinating observation from this study as well. And in the handout materials for this session, you'll also find a couple more studies with some more slides with a bit of detail to dive into this deeper as well. So we'll take a little, recommend taking a little look at that as well. Okay, so that's just set us out a bit of context around this, and that's that additional information. So giving us that purpose really to show why the drivers are clear here. So I'm going to hand over to Landon now, who will be starting to look at the landscape segment with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fiona. So now that we've had a look at the case for gender equality, let's narrow in a little bit more and have a look at the state of the market. So in the next section, we'll home in on some key terms used when discussing gender equality. But before we get there, we're going to do another quick Menti. So if you go back to your Menti or refer back to it, the link in the chat, we're going to test your knowledge of the current state of the market and how much further we have to go to reach equality. So you can, when you go to the Menti, you can move the slider to make a guess as to when we'll achieve gender equality globally on our current trajectory. And you can answer in increments between between 0 and 500, but in increments of 10. So give you a few seconds. What do you think? How many years to achieve gender equality? Okay, seeing some folks come in. A decent amount of answers coming in with pretty near future, 10, 20, 30 years, I think. I can't see the specific numbers right now on my side, but seeing a spike close to 10. So I'll give you a few more seconds. What do you think? I see Michelle says 130 years in the chat. Okay. Someone one-upped Michelle and said 140 in the chat. So, okay, there we go. Okay. I think we have a good amount of answers there, so we'll end the Menti here. Okay. So unfortunately, you see the correct answer there. It's a very long time before we'll see gender equality on this current trajectory. So this is according to a report by UN Women. And yeah, it'll be nearly 300 years, about 285 before we achieve gender equality. Now, I'll note this measurement differs based on how we measure equality. For example, the latest WEF, or World Economic Forum, Global Gender Gap report indicated it may take 130 years to achieve equality based on their calculations. So a bit more optimistic, but overall, we're not seeing an indication that equality of people based on gender will be achieved in our lifetime. We'll go to the next Menti now, please. And okay, great. So you may be familiar with an American study that went viral indicating that fewer large companies are run by women than by men, specifically just named John, a sure indicator that the glass ceiling remains firmly in place in corporate America. So among chief executives of S&P 1500 firms, for each woman, there are 4 men named John, Robert, William, or James alone. So that study was obviously based in the USA. So, you know, it very much varies based on country, and your country is probably different. But what do you think the percent of CEOs listed in your country or in Asia are women? So what do you think for Asia? And I know that's I've worked in Asia previously. I know it's a huge region, so it's broad, but what do you think for that big market? Okay. Now, apologies. I made an error. So what do we think the CEO of listed companies just in your country? So apologies, not Asia, just Pakistan. So that might change your answer a little bit if you think Pakistan is above or different than the Asia average. So what do we think? Okay. Okay, I think there's lots of answers. Apologies, I probably threw you off a bit there mentioning Asia and then mentioning just Pakistan. But I'm seeing lots of people come in the chats, 2, 3%, 1%, 5 to 10. Lots of, I think the consensus from my brief look here and at the Menti is probably folks are thinking less than 10%. So do we want to see if we could see the answer here, Fiona? Right. So your most folks' hunch was correct. It is unfortunately only about 2% for your country. Yeah, so obviously incredibly low, and we'll talk more about some more averages in Asia and other regions as well in a minute. And then if we could go to the next poll, please. So now we're asking what specific percent of board seats or what percentage of board seats are held by women in your country. So do we think maybe that's, you know, worse than the last answer? Maybe there's more board seats held than CEOs. It could be worse. What do you think? What does your either you may know, so please use you know, if you know the answer, please put it in, or if not, what does your gut tell you? What do you think? And I love the activity in the chat, but also it'd be great if you can try to use the Menti as well, please. We love the participation, but having folks answer in the Menti is also really helpful for us. It helps us review some of the data afterwards too. Thank you so much. Okay, let's end it there. And let's see what percentage of board seats are held by women in your country. Okay, so as we see, much better than 2%. The CEO data, 13%, but it's a far cry off of what we like to discuss as the number to see a major difference when we're talking about diversity and voices being heard, which is about 30%, which we'll discuss more in this session. So fantastic. We'll go back to the slides now, and we'll discuss a bit more status of gender in boardrooms. Okay, there we go. So for those who haven't seen these publications before, the SSE in collaboration with IFC, UN Women, and other partners have worked together to provide markets with an overview or benchmark of current progress on gender in leadership of listed companies. Excuse me. So let's dive into one of these reports now to see how it goes. 1 second. So this is last year's report covering the G20 and regional groupings. So on your screen now, you just have the first section. Excuse me. There we go. The first section, which covers the G20. We'll also share the link to the publication in the chat so that you can read it in your own time as well. And of course, all these reports can be found on the SSE publications page. So this data can serve as a benchmark for exchanges and other relevant institutions in their efforts to promote women's full and effective participation in and equal opportunities for corporate leadership positions. Now, let's zoom in a bit more. So the first table that we see on the screen shows that the average percent of boardroom seats held by women in the G20 is about 22%, and there's an overall positive trend line, but still many countries are decreasing from a previous year. And in case you can't quite see it, the top 5 exchanges in the G20 are located in France, the UK, Italy, Australia, and the United States, followed by a few others. It's also worth noting, given that France leads the leaderboard for the G20, that France has a regulatory requirement for women on boards. They require 40% of board seats to be women. However, even though the percentage of women on boards is among the highest in the world, France's female executive leadership pipeline is not quite as strong. So for that reason, in 2021, the French Parliament voted to introduce gender quotas for executive leadership with a 30% minimum for either gender by 2027 and 40% by 2030. And we'll talk a bit more about quotas in a minute. So while we see many countries improving slightly each year, we also see some sliding backwards, and we can still see we have a long way to go. For example, some data from this report shows only 3 markets in the G20 have no all-male boards among their top issuers. That's TSX in Canada, ASX Australia, and NYSE in the United States. And in 11 markets in the G20, more than 20% of the top issuers have male-only boards. So, of course, the G20 is always interesting data to look at, but we'll look beyond that and at some regional data on the next slide. So when we're taking a regional approach to the data on gender equality in corporate leadership, we find only 2 regions have on average over 30%, Europe and US CanZ. This is significant because it's been highly researched that at least 30% representation is required for a fair power distribution distribution and for the less represented group to be heard. So that's that data point, that 30% that I mentioned earlier, where I believe it was the 12 or 13% in Pakistan, which is still far off of the 30. Now, Europe leads with 36% of board seats held by women. It's significantly bolstered by France, though, where 45% of board seats in listed companies of Euronext Paris are held by women. So there's kind of, one specific country really bolstering that 36% for Europe. US CanZ, which includes US, Canada, New Zealand, is not too far behind, you see there with 32%. Africa region averages 22%, but there's a big degree of variance. For example, South Africa JSE exchange has 32% women in board seats, while Egypt's EGX has only 12%, so similar to Pakistan. Southeastern Asia is in fourth place with 19%, and Eastern Asia with 14%. And then Latin America 12%, and Western Asia with 7%. So you can see Pakistan is somewhat in line with Asia there. So continuing to discuss some data here. If you could just give 1 second, we'll look at some more data. There we go. So now looking specifically at the region. So of course, we have Malaysia, which is leading with the 26% of board seats held by women, followed by Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines with 20%, Singapore 18%, and then India, China, and Japan. So we have an average of 16%. And there we go. So then you see the 16% is obviously brought, it's lower down than you'd expect from the first slide, because then we have Bangladesh with 15 and 15, China with 14, Nepal 13, and then go right to Pakistan 13, which we mentioned earlier. And then I'll just note Korea, KRX is the lowest there with just 10. So you see Pakistan is obviously towards the bottom in terms of the percentage of board seats held by women. And you see that the percentage firms with at least 30% women on boards is only 2%. Which I believe, if I remember right, is the lowest in Asia. The percent firm with all male boards is only 6%, so that's better than a lot of Asia. You can see here just above it, Indonesia has 47% firms with all male boards, so not a lot of diversity there. And then, as mentioned, only 2% CEO positions held by women, and 3% chair positions held by women, which again is quite low. So moving along, let's discuss now, and we'll use the chat for this. What do you think are some barriers, or what do you think might prevent a company in your region or country to move ahead on these particular metrics? So to improve them, to increase diversity, so to have, for example, less all-male boards, or more percentage CEO women. So what do you think in the chat would be barriers preventing progress to see more women in leadership positions? Okay, mindset. Okay, that's an interesting one. I like to also hear more what you mean about mindset, because there's a couple ways to interpret that one, but definitely not wrong. Gender biases, absolutely. That's something we'll definitely be discussing more throughout the session. Skill set, yeah, absolutely. We'll discuss that more as well. Governance, regulators, encouraging female leaders, paradigm shift, male domination, absolutely. A lot of the countries and all the countries we talked about still experiencing some dominance in terms of the systems. Culture plays, yes, absolutely, cultural norms and social expectations, gender-based opportunities, more on norms. I'm seeing a lot on norms, which is definitely something we'll touch on. Stereotyping, yeah, that's a really good thing to bring up. Lack of interest. Okay, that's interesting too. Okay, a few more seconds and then we'll discuss this a little bit more. System of patriarchy. Yeah, that's absolutely, that's what I was just referring to with that male domination piece, that there is a patriarchal system. And yeah, Nimra, lots of good answers there. Okay, well, lots of great answers there, lots of good ideas and good answers, but we'll move along in the interest of time. So some key barriers. So in addition to the structural obstacles faced by women in the general workplace, such as unequal regulatory environments, which I believe one person mentioned, lack of workplace flexibility, conflicts between work and family obligations, there are specific barriers that narrow women leadership's paths and cause the drop in representation at the top. This is really where we dive into the complexities of this topic. So I highly recommend reviewing these on your own time as well. But in the meantime, let's go through a few that were maybe not mentioned in the chat or were mentioned, but I'll provide a little bit more substance as well. So one I don't think was mentioned was limited availability of sex disaggregated data and inconsistent reporting practices. This can make it difficult to measure progress or understand the extent of the gender gap. A common term or phrase we say is, to understand it, you need to measure it, or yeah. So the next one, lack of training and professional development opportunities. Someone mentioned that. Absolutely. Particularly in areas with frontline operational or financial responsibilities that can hinder women's attainment of qualifications. Lack of gender-sensitive human capital management, including in hiring, retention, and promotion practices, such as non-diverse hiring committees, limited use of gender-blind applications. I'm sure folks have heard those have gone viral a number of times, where based on a potential job candidate's name, whether a board hiring for that application sees it as male or female, a man or a woman, that can greatly negatively impact women, unfortunately. And then there's also failure to recruit widely for applicants or not embedding a gender lens into job postings. Something that was mentioned a lot when we asked for answers was biases and stereotypes, which suggest women don't have the characteristics needed to lead, such as logical thinking and decisiveness, or creating a double bind in which women are expected to be nice or competent, but they can't be nice and competent. So those biases are more subtle than the norms that deliberately exclude women and can be more challenging to overcome. There's also lack of awareness or skepticism about the business case for gender balanced leadership. That can mean initiatives to advance women may not be a top strategic priority for companies. Now, there's lots of men on the call, and I think as allies, men in leadership who have embraced the values of diversity and inclusion, together we can help to elevate the importance of such initiatives and drive action. maybe using some of the power and privilege we benefit from to help lift others up, and help give others opportunities as well. There's also limited access to networks and connections, which can make board and management qualified women less visible to nominating committees and to prominent men who could advocate as allies and champions. Again, a really important role for men when we discuss gender equality is being an ally and a champion for others who don't have the same opportunities we may have had. Lack of access to role models, mentors, coaches, and sponsors, that can all stunt a woman's leadership potential. So individuals can play important roles in boosting women's self-confidence, guiding their professional journeys, and championing their advancement. So yeah, we will discuss that more as well in a bit. The importance of role models in a hypothetical example we'll use. There's also unsuitable work environments in traditionally male-dominated industries, such as water utilities, just one example, which can make it more difficult for women to pursue long-term career paths. That could be, for example, not having women's locker rooms for changing out of uniforms. And that's just one of many examples. There can also be safety concerns in operational locations and gender-based violence and harassment, which can represent serious deterrents to women's professional advancement. That's definitely really important to note is the woman in a workplace feeling safe and comfortable, and limiting any sexual violence or sexual abuse, etc. These events can all lead to, reduced productivity, increased absenteeism, higher employee turnover, among many other issues, and it can also deter women from pursuing the promotions and career development opportunities. So it's important to note that achieving a truly gender diverse senior leadership team and optimizing the true value in diversity is about more than just the numbers and gaining parity in representation. So the key is ensuring that men and women have equal voices and agency once they're in those leadership roles, so that they all can contribute to determining their organization's path. So to increase the number of women leaders and prepare them to take on leadership roles, companies must also truly invest in women. This means attending to the culture and purpose of their organizations, and it means adopting a more people-focused business model as part of an approach that integrates an ESG orientation into all aspects of operations. Now, we have a slide here on reasons for lack of progress on gender responsive climate action. And if you'd like to dive a bit deeper into this topic, Fiona has just shared an IFC study that's really interesting. So I recommend reading that recent publication on gender responsive climate governance from IFC. This report looks at why we're not seeing the level we'd like to see. In other words, what barriers are getting in the way. Some examples of what the report find are a lack of knowledge or training on the topic, a low level of climate and gender lens literacy, and low understanding of the impacts on business. So as mentioned, we've shared that study in the chat, so please feel free to look at that. And with this, I'll turn it back over to Fiona to run through some language on our topic before we head to a break.
Brilliant. Thank you, Landon. So as he just mentioned, we're going to be going into a bit more on some of the key terms now, quickly when we're discussing gender equality, before we take that break, as we mentioned. So before we go into some official definitions, we'd really like to get a sense from you all as to what gender means to you. So if you return to Menti, which hopefully you should still have open, we've got a bit of a question just to really get a sense from you all on what really gender means. So there's no right or wrong answer here. And if you can only think of a word, maybe more than a definition, that's absolutely fine. Just feel free to share any words that come to mind for you. Okay. Just give you all another second to have a little think about that. As I said, you have a definition in your head, go for it. Or if you just have a word that comes to mind, that's fine as well. So just let us know what you think. Or if anyone is having trouble getting into Menti, you can share in the chat. But obviously, as we said, it's great to get them in Menti if we can. Okay, so we have behavior and physical orientation as our first responses. Give it a second, see if a few more of you might have some views. Great, okay. So we have confidence, distinguishing, so support, responsibility, nature versus nurture. Yeah, that's a very interesting debate for sure. Equality, identity, respect. Inner strength, yeah, that's an interesting one. Being, support, classification. The roles assigned to sex. Female. Give it another moment or two just for any final responses, but lots of good ideas there. Individuality. Specification. See, we have equality and confidence in the chat as well. Constructed sexual identity. Great, thank you everyone for sharing. Oh, I just see some more. I'll give that a second. Lovely, thank you. So social and cultural differences, I think, is new there, and biological identity. Maybe we had that. Creating an ecosystem. Interesting. Physical attributes, physical appearance. Okay, yeah, lots of interesting ideas there. As we say, some things focusing on gender as a classification, and others thinking perhaps about some of the abstract assumptions that sit behind it as well. That's great though. So I think we will now return to the slides. So I'll just get those back open, but I think that's great to get a sense from you all as to what's front of mind for you. And, you know, I think that's already showing there's lots of different ways that we can define this topic. So moving to a more official definition, I guess, that we're going to be using for these purposes, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and understand the depth of gender, which isn't, of course, just simply sex or being male or female. So the purpose of this initial exercise is to make sure that everyone understands that gender is not the same as sex, and that gender can differ in different contexts and societies. So it's important because it's not really different sexes we always need when we're speaking about the value of diversity. It's actually different ways of thinking, different life experiences or lived experiences, and different institutional restrictions or freedoms. So whilst the term gender is actually quite difficult to define because it's something different potentially to different people, let's briefly get a better idea of what's included in this complex term. So UN Women defines gender as the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, and the relationships between women and men and girls and boys, as well as the relations between women and those between men. So these attributes, opportunities, and relationships are socially constructed and are learned through socialization processes, as some of you mentioned in your responses. So they are context, time-specific, and changeable. Gender determines what is expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or man in a given context. And in most societies, there are differences and inequalities between women and men in their responsibilities that they're assigned, the activities that they undertake, access to and control over resources, and as well as decision-making opportunities. So gender is part of the broader socio-cultural context. Other important criteria for socio-cultural analysis may also include class, race, poverty level, ethnic group, and age. So as such, gender is not quite as simple as male or female. Gender can be influenced and defined based on the nature of certain relationships, based on hierarchies, on history, on context, and on institutional or cultural norms. And most importantly, when we're discussing gender equality today, please remember that we're referring to equality of the genders, not simply increasing women on boards. So feel free to explore this and other gender equality terms in the Gender Equality Glossary developed by UN Women, which you can see the link to in the slides that you'll be able to access from your handout. So diving a little bit deeper now, I'm sure you've heard of the acronym DEI, which stands for Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion. So starting with this, we're increasingly seeing DEI managers or teams focusing on ensuring an organization's DEI performance. So why not just diversity teams or just equity teams? So we'll dig a little bit deeper into each of these concepts. So starting with equity, which is ensuring that there is an equitable power distribution among people. You can think of equity as providing men and women with the same microphone that amplifies their voices to the same extent so that everyone can hear them equally. So diversity is then around ensuring representation. So the act of inviting underrepresented genders to join the board enhances diversity of a board. So think of diversity as having enough seats at the table for diversity to be represented. And again, differences and different lived experiences are important to organizations. So it's not enough to have the microphone at the table to make sure everyone can speak at the same volume, but also enough chairs so that a diverse group of participants are at the table, are able and willing to speak. And then that's also why we have inclusion. And inclusion refers to the behaviors and the practice of making all members of the organization feel welcomed, giving them the equal opportunity to connect, to belong, and to grow, to contribute to the organization and advance their careers and ultimately feel comfortable and authentic in themselves. So if we bring that all together, we can say that diversity is being invited into the boardroom. Equity is then having the empowerment to speak at the boardroom. And inclusion is being listened to within that boardroom. But of course, this goes much further than the boardroom. Of course, that's just an example. And really, this is an organization-wide approach. The end goal of which is then equality, which depends on all three of these circles: diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can have diversity without equity or inclusion, and then it won't be sustained. And equally, we could have equity without diversity, and then we won't be making any progress necessarily. So when we talk about equality today and in the next session, it's really important to remember we're not simply looking for an equal number of men and women. What we're really wanting is these three things: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so hopefully that was a useful concept to get clear on. And with that, we'll just be taking a short break now before we move on to our next standards section on standards. So please take 5 minutes. If we can aim to return here when the timer finishes, but feel free to take a little stretch of the legs, grab a drink, etc. And we'll see you back here in 5 minutes' time. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, hopefully that was a nice break. Stretch your legs or grab a cup of tea. But if we could come back to our screens now, we'll get started on the next section. Okay, so now that we have the initial concepts clear, let's dive a bit into the content and start with how we can enhance an organization's performance on gender equality. So the objective of our next unit, Align, is to ensure that your practices align with the global best practices and standards, as well as any local or peer practices that should guide your efforts as well. So let's begin by looking at the global principles that companies can use to enhance their practices on this topic. And the global standards we're going to discuss today are the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, also known as WEPs. So we're going to go into a Zoom poll here. If you give me 1 second, I'll launch that. Oh, thank you. So do you know if your organization is already a signatory of the UN Women's Empowerment Principles? Yes, no, or I don't know. We just want to get a sense of your current familiarity with the WEPs. So if your organization is not yet a signatory, because I'm seeing lots of no's come in, we'll also give you some information about how to become one at the end of this section. Give folks a few more seconds. Okay, we'll end the poll there. So as you can see, only about 13% answered yes, and lots of folks said they don't know. But the good news is we'll also help you to learn how to sign up or find out if you are a signatory or not. Now, we are very lucky to have with us today an expert on the UN WEPs, as was introduced at the beginning. Nabila is joining from UN Women with us today to help provide an overview of the WEPs and answer any of your questions about the women's empowerment principles. So before she gets started, let's play a quick video that introduces the WEPs.
Think about the impact of a signature. Think about the magnitude of a global movement. Think about the difference you can make and the power of transformative change. By signing the Women's Empowerment Principles, you can galvanize your shareholders and stakeholders to drive change in the workplace, marketplace, and community through a framework of 7 principles. Brought to you by UN Women and UN Global Compact, the Women's Empowerment Principles are a roadmap for business sustainability, innovation, and productivity. Businesses by the thousands and in every sector are becoming part of this world-changing movement to advance gender equality. Businesses that become models for attracting talent, entering new markets, serving their communities, and measurably improving the bottom line. Because gender equality means better business. Don't miss this moment to make a lasting impact on your employees, suppliers, customers, and investors. Join leading companies already on the journey to greater sustainability and growth. Commit to the Women's Empowerment Principles and make today your organization's signature moment.
Okay, fantastic. So the video gives a little bit more of an overview, but with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nabila to talk us more through the Women's Empowerment Principles now.
Thank you, Landon. I'm Nabila Malik. I'm head of partnerships and communications at the UN Women Pakistan office. I'm delighted to be part of this training to go over the women empowerment principles, or in short, we call them WEPs, with you. I'm also happy to see some of our signatories there. Some are non-signatories. So I hope you can use this time to either refresh your memory or learn about the WEPs. With the increasing importance of ESG, many companies are realizing the importance of gender equality. Yet, many are unclear on how to advance gender equality and women empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. Companies are using WEPs as a guide, as a blueprint to position gender equality in the core business strategy, as well as through their operations and beyond. WEPs provide a holistic framework for companies to advance gender equality and women empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community, and drive positive outcome for society and business. It provides a roadmap for implementing the Sustainable Development Goal 5. The slide that you see in front of you is a map of the WEPs signatory. You can see that WEPs is a global agenda, and CEOs from over 10,000 companies from more than 190 countries around the world have made public commitment to WEPs. In Pakistan, we have more than 150 signatories. 150 companies have already signed up for it. Now I will give you an overview of the 7 principles you can see here on the slide. The principles are not organized in a sequence of importance, yet grouped by different pillars in rather random order. Companies that sign up to all the 7 principles of WEPs have to sign up for all. It's a package when joining the WEPs. So I'll go with over one by one and try and explain a little bit what the principles are. Principle 1 is a standalone principle. Builds on the foundation for the WEPs work. It requires the CEO's commitment and buy-in from the executive team to make gender equality a core corporate strategy and place on the day-to-day agenda. It is not solely about adding more women into the leadership position, but rather making sure to get buy-in from executive leadership to take gender equality seriously. Principle 2, 3, 4 focus on the workplace. Number 2 is treating all men and women fairly at work without discrimination. 3, and ensuring employee health, well-being, and safety. 4 is about providing education and training for career advancement. I would like to highlight the importance of thinking outside the box to achieve this. And just to give you an example, a bank from Spain that was able to successfully address these challenges faced under Principle 2 realized that men were prone to move up the ladder in their company and women were being left behind. So they analyzed the corporate culture that they were having, and they realized that men were making progress and getting better positions because they had the luxury to stay longer in the office after hours. And women, because they had their domestic duties, had to go home. So in a very interesting move, what the bank did, that it decided to enforce a policy that the office will close at 7 sharp and no one could stay after work in the office. So that gave women a level playing field and made a difference. Principle 5 focuses on the marketplace. Here we encourage companies to leverage their power to influence broader value chain. Companies can work on fostering diverse supply chain and gender responsive marketing. At UN Women, we work with companies to pursue gender responsive procurement as part of pursuing a sustainable supply chain. Principle 6 focuses on community. This is when companies are pursuing initiatives and advocacy. We encourage companies to consult and engage with women and girls in local communities before rolling out any initiatives so that women and girls can truly benefit. And those of you working in the IT industry can very well understand this point. Lastly, principle 7 is an underpinning principle to measure results. We recommend companies to regularly collect data from internal and external stakeholders to understand their perceptions and needs regarding gender equality and publicly report their progress. Because, like we realized further before as well, without proper data, it's very difficult to understand where we are going and whether the impact of our initiatives. So becoming a web signatory is about going on a journey together for gender equality. And the companies need to work on engaging internal and external stakeholders and make ongoing and meaningful progress after signing up. When doing so, we encourage companies to tackle deeply rooted systemic inequalities rather than just taking the easy road. The image in this slide, as you can see, shows the steps after signing up. Companies are expected to activate internal stakeholders while showing the company's commitment to gender equality on the profile page, then engage external stakeholders through the value chain, working on advancing gender equality, women empowerment in their supply chain and marketing practices, and then work on sustaining and reporting through collecting data and reporting on the company's progress. This may sound like a difficult process, but UN Women offers over 300 tools and resources to guide companies on how to work on the webs. So once you sign up, you have access to all these tools and resources. How you can become a web signatory. Your company needs to be legally registered. We accept companies from all sectors, sizes, ownership types. Stock exchanges are eligible. In fact, 35 stock exchanges have already made a commitment to webs. Continue with the application process. You can simply go to the webs.org website to fill out the online join form to apply to become a web signatory. So this is the website that you go. This is the link, and you join as a web signatory. We can, at the UN Women, those who are planning to join can always contact us, and we are more than happy to help you and support you at every step of the way. And last but not the least, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have ring the bell activity with Stock Exchange that we do all the time. And for now, this is all from my side. Over to you, London. If you have any question, you can put it in the Q&A and I'll be happy to answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nabila. And for folks and participants on the call, Please do feel free to ask any questions you might have about the WEPs while we have a WEPs expert here with us. But that was a great introduction, and we recommend that all of those looking for a first step on this topic, that you start by working with your leadership to become signatories of the WEPs if you're not already. And for those that are already WEPs signatories, which are more and more pretty much, I think every day, we wanted to also flag what you can consider doing next. So this slide here highlights one of the options available, which is taking your commitment a step further by having your gender equality practices certified. So EDGE provides a certifying service that can help you take your practices that additional step further. It also provides a communication tool to show the market that you're a leading company on gender equality. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Fiona.
Great, thank you, Landon. So now that we've looked at some of those global initiatives, we're going to be having a look next at what should be considered based on your location. So one of the key factors that should be considered based on where your company is listed, as well as where your main operations are, is of course regulation. So let's discuss what we're seeing here from a regulatory perspective as well. So on this slide, we can see a number of markets where there's some kind of gender quota or requirement set for listed companies from a past report that we produced. And on the right, you can see the current status of gender equality on the boards of companies in these markets, and as well also the percentage of female board chairs and CEOs. So a question we often get asked is whether or not quotas or mandatory requirements work, and if this should be implemented in a country. So this is, of course, a hotly debated topic. And if you'd like to dig it into a bit deeper, you can review some extra slides as well that we've included in your handout, which provides some more insights from a recent study by the UNPRI about gender-based quota policies. But as we've seen in the data we discussed already today, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. So why is that? Well, it's not entirely the reason, but a part of this is because it really depends on how the company implements these quotas, what actions are taken by the company, and how such a rule or regulation might be interpreted. So let's come down to the company level now to see what we mean by how a company implements this. And we're going to do a little bit of an exercise together. So to do this exercise, we're going to discuss two hypothetical companies. We're going to call one Owl Inc. and the other company we're going to call Peacock PLC. So these, of course, are entirely fictitious companies, but the discussion we're going to have on their decision-making processes is based on research into real companies as well. So both of these companies have only got about 10% of women on their boards and in their executive leadership, but both have parity or about 50-50 split between genders in the overall lower level of the organizations. So it's clear that women are not currently getting into higher level positions. They also have another thing in common. They both have just had a change in leadership and have had a new CEO join. And let's say that both CEOs are expecting new regulations to come in, so they're preparing for a mandatory rule related to gender equality. And the new CEO at both companies is passionate about gender equality, and they want to achieve equality at the top of their companies in their board and leadership positions, so that they can be included in a gender equality index, which is going to give them more exposure to investors that really value gender parity. So each company, however, has taken a different approach towards that goal of gender equality, and therefore they do have different results. So let's discuss their two approaches and what they do. First, looking at Peacock PLC. So as we've said, Peacock has a new CEO, and they've set a bold target of 40% women in leadership positions in 2 years. And to help reach this 40%, the CEO makes a big announcement to staff and shares her experience climbing the ladder and uses this example to encourage other women to follow her to the top. They also set a hiring freeze on any men until that target is reached. And some employees are perhaps quite excited about this and some empowered, but some are scared of the pressure to move up. So for women, there might be some more pressure. And for some men, of course, they may have some concerns about their job security as well. So overall, the sentiment in the organization can be some excitement, perhaps, about this initiative, but a bit of fear. So let's look at what their competitor, Owl Inc. does instead. So Al Inc. also has a new female CEO, and it's also committed to gender equality in leadership positions. However, instead of the 40% target and the hiring freeze, the CEO decides to join the 30% club. And if you're not familiar with this, the 30% club calls on its members to commit to at least 30% female representation on their boards and executive leadership teams, because 30% is the critical mass at which minority voices become heard. And so they want to actually surpass this 30% versus the 40% as a top target. So they want to achieve and surpass 30%, but the CEO isn't sure of the root cause and is confused why some women aren't moving from operational level positions to leadership positions. So she sets up an internal task force to find out what the root causes may be in their organization, preventing women from climbing to the top. And at the same time, the CEO also initiates a reverse mentoring program. 50% of the workforce is already women, so why aren't leadership learning from them and hearing their experiences already? This can allow leadership to benefit from a more diverse perspective at the operational level, while also helping their staff to progress in their careers. Okay, so we've heard a little bit there about the two different companies and their approach, and we're now going to take a bit of a minute to rank those activities and think about what you think will be most effective versus least effective. So if you can pop back into your Mentees, if you find the link in the chat, I think as well, we're going to get you to reflect on some of those practices that we've just discussed, the different organizations taking, and see which you think will be most effective. So I'll just share that Menti with you so we can see your thoughts as they come through. So as I said, just take a moment in the Menti to rank some of those strategies. So as we said, we have the setting of the 40% target for women. We have the sharing of personal examples and role models in the case of that CEO who used her own career. We've got initiating the hiring freeze of the overrepresented gender, joining the 30% club, creating a gender equality task force, or initiating a reverse mentoring program. So I'll give you all just another couple of moments to read through those options and put in your ranking from 1st to 6th of which you think is most effective there. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion around that. Okay. See a few people have responded. I'll give you all a little bit longer to put your answers in before we have a quick discussion on those. But I say try to be quick if you can. We'll just keep moving with time to make sure we get through all of the session. Okay. Right. Seem to have slowed off there. So I think we'll move on to discussing those pieces. So we see creating a task force on gender equality coming out as our top answer here, I think. And this is a really good starting point. We also see the setting a target of, sharing examples of role models has just swapped to second place. And again, this is really good. And we often see that since women don't have effective role models, this can be definitely a positive thing. And then we have the setting of a 40% target versus joining the 30% club. We have to remember that 40% is higher, but this is a top target, while 30% is a bottom target where they want to surpass this. So those different approaches may work better for different organizations. And the hiring freeze I see as the bottom point. Again, yeah, we would agree here that this can be a little bit dangerous since it may demotivate men in an organization without seeing the whole picture of what's happening. So yeah, I think those rankings are really interesting. And I think just a few points to highlight here is that, of course, as we say, we have to be really mindful of bringing along all individuals within the organization, making sure that we're communicating clearly the reasons for these measures. Sharing those personal examples is very important. And actually that thing about reverse mentoring as well is a great way to form that two-way communication between your leadership teams and individuals in operational roles and help to overcome some of those barriers. So yeah, I think this is, really interesting to get your thoughts on those areas. So what we'll do now is we'll revert back to looking at our company examples. Sorry, just excuse me 1 second. Great. And we'll have a little bit of a look at what we thought this might have resulted in for the companies. So going back to Peacock, let's look at some of the impacts that they may have had as a result of taking that approach that they took. So they saw some immediate progress from setting a quota, but they didn't identify the underlying issues that were the root cause of a lack of female leaders. And so they didn't have that much success, perhaps, in promoting women as a result. And they also demotivated some of the men in the organization who felt perhaps that they had less job security and less opportunity to grow as well. And so what they didn't realize from doing a lack of analysis internally is that there were other issues present. So for example, there were some barriers relating to their work culture, their benefits, there were unconscious biases, etc. Filling positions also took longer, and there was sometimes wasn't the right candidate when they were only hiring women. And so external hiring to fill positions wasn't always successful either. So as a result, there was some culture change in the organization. There was higher turnover, which led to less innovation and some risks as well. So whilst we can say that the CEO here had really great intentions with setting a high target and initiating that bold hiring freeze, because they weren't really aware of the root causes of gender inequality at their organization, they couldn't necessarily effectively address it. So let's see how that things worked out at Owl Inc. So whilst Owl's new CEO had similar ambitions, of course, they went about it differently. And it's important to note that Owl Inc. may have had to invest more upfront, perhaps, in their approach, but it's likely that they would see more of a return on investment. So they took a more holistic approach, and through setting up their task force and doing that analysis, they realized that actually to achieve gender equality, it needed to not only be accepted by the whole organization, but they needed to tackle some of the specific issues that they were seeing. So creating that task force and implementing a reverse mentorship program meant that they could identify some of the different barriers, such as inflexible working arrangements, perhaps biased benefits, or a lack of support for certain genders to be able to succeed. And also through using that mentoring program, they were able to affect their leadership culture more directly as well. So as a result, we saw a real increase in innovation, and they ended up actually saving resources as well associated with new hires, so they could continue to train and educate their staff members and further enhance their culture. So we hope that little exercise there just sort of brings to life some of the concepts and how actually the nuances of how this plays out can differ. So as I've mentioned on the corporate culture side of things, regulation doesn't depend on only a quota if you choose to set it, but also the corporate culture and potential deeper issues that may be at play within your organization. So on this note regarding corporate culture, we won't necessarily go into a lot of detail on this, but we recommend reviewing this slide perhaps in some detail in your own time. It gives you a useful list of areas to think about as you're sort of just try and think more holistically, and obviously try and avoid some of those mistakes that we saw in the Peacock PSC example. Okay, so just to wrap up this section, we're going to have a very quick second poll here just to get a sense from you all as to what you think about improving your financial performance. So this is really thinking about actually what directly contributes to financial performance. So which of these elements would help improve financial performance? Would that be implementing policies that promote gender diversity, creating all women boards, collecting gender disaggregated data, only promoting women until you reach parity, or setting gender-based targets? So take a second, we'll go quite quickly, I think, if that's okay, but we'll just get a sense from you as which of these you think would improve a company's financial performance. So I'll give you another 10 seconds on that before we move along, if that's okay. Alrighty, I will close the poll there. Sorry, I know it was quite quick. But yeah, so we have the correct answers here would be options 1, 3, and 5. So most of you correctly identified number 1. And of course, all of these things are important to do in tandem. So for example, with just gender-based targets but no policies, you're not necessarily going to ensure that women are supported to stay in their leadership roles. And if the data isn't collected to enable you to understand those issues, then you're likely going to be missing the root causes of the problem. So it's really important, as we say, have those policies, collect the gender disaggregated data to know how they're working, and set those targets to really drive performance as well. So I think most of you who responded correctly identified 1 and 5 there, but we definitely recommend the data side of things as well. Okay, so that moves us along then to our next segment on alignment. And here we're thinking in particular around our peers. So to add a bit of colour to this discussion, I'm going to hand back over to Nabila now, who's going to briefly talk to us about some sector and industry-based practices. So over to you again, Nabila.
Thank you, Fiona. So, for some examples of implementing the WEPs by the WEP signatories. One thing that's common is they have an action plan, set achievable targets, and WEPs can guide in both. So from the workplace example, there's a bank in Sweden tackled the gender pay gap for their 16,000 employees in 4 countries it operates in, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Sweden. They put in place a job evaluation system and kept it updated regularly. This was critical to understanding what makes roles comparable to others and how equal pay can be measured. They also followed up with close monitoring and reporting of the program and produced reports on regular basis. Another example on this side, on the workplace side, is a management company in South Africa implemented a 40 by 2020 strategy, which aimed to boost women representation in their workplace to 40% across all senior levels of the company by 2020. This is a bit old. The company launched a women's leadership development program to increase the number of women recruited, and by having this clear goal and action plan, the company achieved 41% of women in senior level positions. I have a couple of examples from the marketplace issues that were identified. A bank in Palestine has been supporting women-owned businesses to improve financial inclusion for women in the country. They provided comprehensive financial awareness, banking literacy training to women-owned businesses. They ran a mini MBA program for women entrepreneurs to develop their business development skills and access financial products to support them in growing their businesses. A financial platform in the US had a goal to boost the amount of lending to women entrepreneurs, especially from small businesses, providing them greater economic resilience and independence. They created a specific fund that looked into improving the flow of capital to women-owned businesses and lowered their cost of capital. They made certain amount of their capital had been contributed women-owned businesses at around 40% annually. And last but not the least, the companies participated in WEP's Business Accelerator to support their WEP's journey with UN Women's support. Thank you. Over to you, Fiona.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nabila, for that. That's super helpful to get that real world view on how this is working in practice. Okay, brilliant. So that brings us along to a few resources again on this front that we'd recommend checking out in the handout that really can support you in this area as well. Some of which we'll be covering off in our second session later in the week as well in a bit more detail. But with that, I'd like to introduce the guest speaker that we're very fortunate to have us joining here today, Harry Agomba from the Bloomberg team as an ESG specialist. So Harry's going to talk us through a little bit of an example of how Bloomberg are seeing these topics and working on gender indices. So thanks for joining us, Harry, and over to you.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you. Thanks for that. And good to meet everyone. I'm just going to take over the screen share if you give me 1 second. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that full screen now.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I am Harry. I work for Bloomberg on our new gender equality score, formerly known as our gender equality index product, for 3 years now. So I'm a senior data analyst, basically reviewing, collecting, and analyzing all different types of gender data. So I'm going to take you through around 15-minute session on the history of our product, how Bloomberg looks at gender and how we score it, and then a training exercise to put all of that into something a bit more practical and real world examples of how this sort of data can be used and analyzed. So for some background, as I said, we've had a bit of a overhaul of how Bloomberg looks at gender data. So previously we used to run a questionnaire. That started off as an invite-only questionnaire of 23 companies based in America only, also only in the financial section. So it's basically 23 US banks voluntarily submitting data through a questionnaire. We expanded that questionnaire and it got up to around about 650 participants a few years ago, before we realized that we wanted to do something a bit more wide and capture more gender data on more companies. With that, we moved away from this survey and we started capturing data on publicly disclosed companies such as yourselves all around the world. So our new score is based on a pilot universe of just over 3,000 companies. It's about 3,200, and we'll be expanding that to all 15,000 companies that Bloomberg tracks for ESG data by the end of next year. So any company that Bloomberg tracks, as I said, there's over 15, I think there might be nearly 16,000 now, we'll also be scoring them on gender. As part of that, we carried out this open engagement process. So we had all of our survey questions, we had companies that had participated in our survey and hadn't participated in our survey. We talked to them about the sorts of KPIs that we're looking to measure and score. Did they feel they're realistic to measure internally and then make available externally for us to capture? And reviewed all of those sorts of things as part of formulating our new score. And the thing is that it's new. You know, the scores for financial year 2022 went live about a month ago. And financial year 2023 will be out in the new year, and from then on we'll be scoring kind of as and when data is published. It's a new score. It doesn't have a load of corporate awareness, especially at the moment. So there's a real opportunity for anyone who engages early and discloses data early to really get ahead of the curve. Like, there's a decent amount of score that goes to just disclosing this data, because as everyone knows, sometimes gender data can be a little bit sensitive to want to disclose and can be a little bit difficult to measure. So yeah, there is definitely an opportunity for anyone who does that early to be scoring well. Given all of that history, as I said, I want the bulk of this to be a case study and something to get you thinking. So we're going to take 2 companies. So we've got Louis Vuitton, which is a high-profile luxury fashion brand, and we have Under Armour, which is a popular sportswear brand. We have these 2 companies. From now on, they'll be known as Company A and Company B, and by the end of this, I will ask you to basically guess who you think is who. Just take a moment to think about the sort of high-level social biases you may have when you're thinking about these companies. So a fashion company, probably something where more women might want to work, might be more engaged. Under Armour, maybe something that's a bit more mixed, or maybe have a few more men involved. and what benefits they might want to offer to their employees. You know, if Louis Vuitton has a lot of women there, maybe they are used to it and offer more benefits, all of those sorts of things. So we'll take a look at the actual data reported by, you know, these now 2 mystery companies, and look at how data can drive decision making. So firstly, my role working on this gender data and these gender equality scores is actually within Bloomberg's ESG department or sustainability department. One question that I get a lot is, where does gender sit within ESG? How does gender relate to ESG? The answer is that it's kind of in a bit of both. You know, we've got social metrics that we look at, we've got governance metrics that we look at. That's why we've decided to produce this kind of standalone gender equality score. So it's not going to be a subsection of social, it's not a subsection of governance, it's its own standalone thing. So please just take a note of the social and governance scores so that we can look at how they relate to the gender score at the end as well. The social score for company A is a bit higher, and the governance score for company B is a bit higher. That's kind of the main thing to note here. Again, just looking at some of the themes of gender that might be involved in these social and governance metrics. So in social, we have the social supply chain management, and in governance, we have the board composition. So the gender diversity really is something that we look at in the governance score. But as you're about to see, there's so much more to it than just these sub-issues. So again, just make a note, the social supply chain management and the social score of company A is a bit higher, but the gender diversity, I think, is a bit higher. I think my screen share bar is hiding the G score, but the G score of company B is slightly higher. So now we'll look at some of the metrics that we measure exclusively in our gender equality score. So you'll see on the left, company A and company B on the right. So this is all data taken from our survey the last year that we ran it. But all of these metrics will be carried forward into the new public score. So please, you know, bear that in mind when you're reviewing. Company A has more women on the board, and you know, in general, more women throughout all different levels of the business, with the exception of executives. So you can see that in general, company A has more women, it has more new hires, you know, more workforce. This is the section that we call the talent pipeline. So talent pipeline and senior leadership, company A is slightly ahead of company B. What you'll notice is as we look at these, company B doesn't disclose everything. So the % women of total promotions, that's a field where we look at of everyone who received a promotion or an upwards move in the company, what % of those were women. % women new hires is of all of the people that joined the company, what % of those are women. And women attrition is of all of the people that left the company, what % of those are women. See that company B doesn't seem to track that and has a slightly lower sort of pipeline %, but it's not, you know, miles behind, it's not miles off. Then you look at company A, all of these benefits that we ask for, you know, with the exception of the flexible work, is not disclosed by company A. So this is a pillar that we call inclusive culture. So this is making sure that the workplace is supportive and is an environment where it enables women especially to thrive. So we look at parental leave. Parental leave retention rate is a field where we are measuring all of the people who remained employed by the company after coming back from parental leave. So the purpose of this one is really to assess the culture around taking parental leave. Sometimes we see, you know, a really high parental leave benefit in terms of weeks, but then a really low parental leave retention rate, which could indicate that there's a bit of a negative culture or stereotype associated with taking parental leave. Flexible work benefit can be flexible location, flexible schedule, anything like that. And then we have backup family care benefits. So that can include social care for children. It can also include elderly care as well. Both of those are in there. So again, just kind of make a note, company A slightly ahead on the pipeline. Company B is disclosing benefits that company A aren't. And as I said, there's a decent amount of credit as well given in our score to just disclosing metrics, even if it's a no, even if it's, you know, viewed as an unfavorable figure, there's a decent amount of score there. So Now I will ask Fiona or Landon to run a poll for me. Which company do you think is company A? Give everyone a couple of minutes to vote. Yeah, so we've got a 60-40 split. Oh, it's going back. Yeah, about 60-40 split then. So most people seem to, slight majority think that company A is Louis Vuitton. Slight minority think that company A is Under Armour. So I can reveal that company A is in fact, there we go, Louis Vuitton. So yeah, thanks very much for listening to that short exercise. The whole purpose is just to get you start to think about the sort of data that you know Bloomberg as a collector and someone that runs scores are interested in, and also that our clients are invested in. You know, like our clients that are using this score can be corporates who just want to benchmark themselves against each other. They can also be investors who are looking to use this as a signal. So that is the kind of thing that, you know, the market is now moving to disclose towards. As I said, we're scoring over 3,000, expanding to 15,000 later on. And if you are ready to take the next step and start disclosing these metrics, you know, we're also here to help. So we want this to be like an opportunity to engage with us. I'll drop my contact information in the Zoom chat. You can also reach me on LinkedIn. I'll drop email addresses and everything. And if you Google, you know, ESG Bloomberg or Gender Equality Bloomberg, there'll be a website where you can find a contact form as well. So thanks very much, and thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Harry. Really appreciate it. And I think that brings to life a lot of what we've been talking about really well. So great to have that real world example from you there. Lovely. Well, thank you, everyone. So as we're now moving towards the end of the session, I'm going to take you back to Menti very quickly, just to wrap up on the final few points. So you'll see, if you're back in Menti again at the link I've just shared, the question we have for you now just to reflect on as we end is to think about one activity that you're going to take away to help you start to initiate some more improvements on gender equality. So I see some of you have already shared some great responses there. So we have equal contributions, making people realize why gender equality is important, having regular awareness sessions and setting targets, thinking about a mentorship program, also a task force. So that is brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. I'll move us along in the interest of time, but if you haven't had a chance to share with us in Menti, I think that's a great reflection to take away from the session, and just think about that one key step that you'll get started with in the background in the next few days, ideally. But yeah, hopefully, and as we're coming to the end of this session, you're now feeling, I hope, in a slightly better place on those areas that we assessed on at the start of the session. So I'll give you a second just to respond to this, Menti, and just let us know where you feel you are now against those different areas. Great. I see someone who's feeling very confident now. So that's brilliant to see that first off. I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a mix amongst everyone here, but I'm great to see that that firstly is looking better for you. And I see, yeah, so I think most of us are looking higher. So that's brilliant. So if you haven't had the chance, I'll just leave you to respond in the background to that before I very quickly just revert to the slides to cover off a few quick points before we finish off the session. So just to mention, obviously there's a lot to learn in these sessions, and we really appreciate the time that you're taking. And as I've mentioned already, you will receive a completion certificate for joining the training, but it is important to make sure that you join us for our part 2 session on Wednesday in order to receive your certificate. So please do come along then, and we'll be covering off the second part of our agenda as we talked about at the start of the session. But to close off for today, firstly, just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has joined us from our guest speakers. You'll see some contact details here, and I know Harry has shared his in the chat as well, so thanks for that, Harry. So please do refer to the slide handouts on the website if you'd like to get these details as well. But just to say a big thank you again to Harry as our guest speaker from Bloomberg. also to Nabila from UN Women, our partners on this training, and to the Pakistan Stock Exchange, and Rafa for giving us her opening remarks at the start of the session. We'd also just like to say a big thanks to all of our official supporters at the UNSSE who helped to make this training possible, and as well as our partners on this training, IFC, the Government of Luxembourg, Columbia University, and of course, UN Women again. So just to close off today, thank you all for joining us for this part of the session. We really hope it's been useful, and we look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. So we'll close the session there, but thanks again all and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot.